Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for listening in. Today, we're going to talk about how much money you should have by age 45. This is the third of our five-part series of how much money you should have by each age in order for you to be on time, on target. But before we get started, as a reminder, this is an educational show and should not be construed as personal financial advice. Full disclosure can be found at ototnow.com. Now, let's get started. So, we talked about what you should have by 25. You should at least be started. At 35, you're kind of the heart of your career, and you should have a couple of financial engines working for you. And now at 45, as we look at our first step of knowing where you are and the total number of financial engines working for you, you should actually have several financial engines working for you. You probably have your career, or maybe you have your primary job and an additional job. You probably have your emergency fund in place. You should probably be out of debt. It might have crept back in, and we can talk about that. But you should probably be out of debt. You should have an IRA in place. You should be contributing to your 401k, 403b, 40 or thrift savings plan. If you have little ones, if you got married and have little ones, you'll have college saving plans that you could have working for you. So there should really be several things that you should have going. And you should want to know how much all that adds up to, and then how much is that going to get you. So for like college savings, if you start when your first child is born, you put away $100 a month, that's going to get a pretty big chunk of change. If you get $250 a month, that's really going to get you a lot further. So those are the things you should be on top of for knowing where you are and all of the things that you have cooking for you. And then you want to, of course, make sure those engines stay tuned and keep growing at the appropriate rate, which means pay attention to your allocation and your 401k to make sure that you're staying good and aggressive, you're investing through dips in the market, that sort of thing, so you can optimize the long-term return that you can expect out of those investments. Career-wise, though, you could be at that point where if you've put a good 20 years in your first career, you either, like in the military, like my background, it's where I stepped out and finally got to do the second job that I wanted to do in my life, which is what I'm doing today. For others, it's simply retiring out of the military, changing out of uniform into civilian clothes, and then either doing the same sort of thing or pursuing something new. Possibly, if you're 45 and you've saved and invested your whole life, you can actually go off and do something you want to do and not have to worry so much about how much you make. Or maybe that's not your case. Maybe you have to stay in the job whether you love it or not, just because of the income and the expertise that you've developed over 2 decades in the workforce to be able to stay there so you can maximize the money coming in the door. So a lot of things can be going on here at age 45 to think about. But if you were to make a career move, I will say, looking now in the rear view mirror for myself, who made a career change at 43, I left the Air Force as I retired. I left the Air Force and the flying business behind, which I had flown for the past 20 years to that point. Could have gone off to the airlines for my second career, which have taken me from age 43 to age 65, the mandatory retirement. It was a personal choice of mine that I didn't think I would get the job satisfaction out of that I wanted. So I didn't choose that path, and I chose to open my own business. So you could be at that point where you have a big career decision to make. And if you do, like if you're like me and open your own business, realize the money's going to be a little tight. I actually had to reach into some investments that I didn't think I would ever touch. Some of that stuff we talked about when I was in my teens, reach into that to actually get some money to kind of stopgap for the career change that I made. So a lot of things to think about, but if you are going to make a career change, I tend to advise folks or mentor folks in your mid 40s is a good time to do that, where you kind of have the time and energy to throw yourself into something new. I mean, full bore, work the long hours, that sort of thing. Over 50, I'm not sure. I just turned 50 myself last year. I don't know that I have the same energy that I even had when I was 43. So just something to consider. So if you're going to make the move, I would say, yeah, try to make it in your 40s if you can. It's just not quite as, I think, from an energy level perspective, maybe not the same energy in your 50s. So that's my take. But so the first one, know where you are, know the total number of engines that you have working for you. And then, of course, where should we be on target for, financially? How much money should we have? What should our net worth be? We talked about at 25, you just want to be started. By age 35, you should have whatever your salary is. You want to have that one time, that salary put away. So over the past 10 years, from 35 to 45, that one X that you had saved away, invested appropriately, making 7.2% a year will have doubled. So that would be 2X. And in addition, in the past decade, if you save 10% a year, that gets you another X. So really at 45, you should have 3 times your annual salary saved away. So when you add up your investment accounts with your IRAs, 401ks, if you have a brokerage account, I do count college savings in there. You could argue whether you should or shouldn't, but I do because I could always use that for my retirement if I need to. But when you add all that together, if you make $80,000 a year, then that should be $240,000. If you're not there, you need to make some decisions to prioritize. And if you haven't, one thing I like using with folks when I talk to them is adulting. If you choose not to adult in your 30s, which I'd say that's kind of when some people mature early and they adult in their 20s. I would say for, in the real world, that people tend to grow up and start maturing more in their 30s, and they start making, when I talk to folks and work with clients at that level, they're like, yeah, I need to get on this. I got it. Yeah, let's do it. If you're in your 40s having that conversation, not only do you have to get on it, you now have to get on it and make really, really tough, hard decisions. So, that 3X your salary. And again, of course, if you're a high income person up around the 200,000 level, congratulations on your high income skill. But don't forget that if you make 200,000 a year, you probably live a 200,000 a year lifestyle. And that's not cheap. That's not the same lifestyle. You're not living in the same house, likely. You're not driving the same vehicles. You're not vacationing at the same places generally as somebody that's making 80,000 a year. So because you can make more, you do have to save more because you have raised your quality of life level high enough to where if the money goes away, not everybody's able to adjust back down to a lower quality of life. We can all say we can. And I would say if you're in the military, I think that's kind of a skill set that you have because you've been in kind of a bare bones life all through a 20-year military career. No matter your rank or whatever, you can end up sleeping in tents and apartments, that sort of thing. But if you're used to living in the single family home, driving all the nice cars, going all the nice vacation places, it's not easy to dial that back later on. So that's why we use a multiplier of our annual salary, because that's a quality of life that we've gotten used to. So if you make $200,000 a year and you're 45, I am telling you, you should have $600,000 saved away. That should be in your investment accounts. It really should, because you're going to need it later on to continue to fund that same sort of lifestyle. So that's where we are now at 45. We're three times our annual salary. And that's going to deliver us to when if you have that, you can actually start looking at, okay, how many years am I going to work and what's that number going to be? If you don't have that, you really can't even think about retiring in your 50s. Now it's like, ooh, I have to really make some tough choices and maybe I can retire in my 60s. So get on track with that three by annual salary by age 45 and you will be on track. The next part of the 5-step process of staying on time, on target, is knowing about the threats out there. And I will tell you at age 45, your known threats, which are, your life insurance, home insurance, car insurance, health insurance, those are kind of your basic threats that we all know we need to have in place. You maybe by age 45, if you've amassed a significant amount of money, you could be self-insured for life insurance. In other words, you might have enough money on hand. If you have $2 million on hand, and you're 45, you don't really need your term policy for $250,000 anymore. If you've gotten into a whole life policy or any of these others that are very confusing, you've taken all that and put it together, it's a conversation for another day, but generally you're better off just breaking that, taking the cash value out and investing it. You'll be much happier later on, because that's all the insurance company's doing. It's taking your money, investing it, and giving you a little piece of the return. If you do it on your own, you get to keep the entire return. But the biggest thing in 45 is you don't know what the unknown threats are. And there's no way for me to list the unknown threats because they're unknown. You may have had children along the way, and maybe you thought they would all leave the house and maybe one or two are hanging out back at the house. They may have gotten married and come back into the house with maybe a young child. So you're in your young, early 40s and you're already a grandparent. You may have not have planned for that. Well, whole slew of new financial obligations kind of come with that, right? Also, if you think of your parents' age when you're 45, they're probably hitting 70. That's right in the zone for maybe something happening to if your parents are still together. Something happens to one of them and the other one might move back in with you. All kinds of things can happen. Uh, so that's where you kind of need to have your own financial engines working, have that emergency fund in place so you can deal with the catastrophic events that can happen during this time, not necessarily the catastrophic ones, but deal with the unknown threats as they emerge so you can mitigate them, defeat them. This is like being downtown Baghdad when you're 45. You got costs and expenses coming at you. You don't even know who's shooting at you, right? So it's just money goes into the check account, out it goes. And I look at mine and it's pretty much volleyball related expenses, just money flowing everywhere for volleyball. Who knew it costs that much for kids sports, right? So that's the defend against the threats and mitigate others. And then you also, at each stage in your life, need to, after you put everything in place for you're getting 3 extra salary, you've put your insurances in place, you've got an emergency fund to deal with the unknowns out there and mitigate those threats. You now have to calibrate, what is my retirement going to look like? So at 45, you have to ask yourself, if you are still saying things like, I want a home in the Hamptons, but you are making less than a 6-figure income and you've saved less than 3 times that, you aren't on a flight path to get yourself to a home in the Hamptons. So it's time to adult, and as a verb, and say, okay, that's just not going to happen with the path I'm on. Something either needs to change. I need to make a lot more money, which that's very difficult to do. It can be done, but not easy for everybody. So, or you need to start making your plans for later on more in line with the path that you're on. So airplane analogies, right? You don't have the fuel to make it to the West Coast, so you better start planning on cutting short somewhere. So those are things that aren't always easy to do. They're certainly not easy to do by yourself. So depending if you're in a relationship or married, having that discussion with your spouse, you really need to kind of figure out what's important to you at that point. I would say back in the day, it used to be paying off your house. That's a common goal that I hear people throw out there all the time, is I just want to get out from under my mortgage payment so I don't have that when I'm retired. Well, when you look at the sheer math of all the financials, is that advice was very smart when the interest rates were up at 6-7% for a mortgage. Now that the interest rates for the 30-year are down either at 3 or just above 3%, you're actually better off, from a mathematic perspective of, if you can stay fully invested in the market and ride through the waves, you're going to have a ton more money than you would ever have if you buried a bunch of money into your house. And that also can lead people to, and everybody's different, so don't stop listening just because, if it's your goal, then you go after your goal and you do it aggressively and be happy that you did it, right? But if you're looking at the mathematic perspective, you're going to have a lot more money, a lot higher quality of life later on if you don't sink a bunch of cash into an asset that's growing at maybe 2 to 3% a year. I live in Austin, which is a fantastic real estate market, so we're making a little bit more than that. But I realize that A, that doesn't last forever. That can change. And B, not everybody lives in a growing area. So just something to consider. But really, it's time. You're adulting. You're 45. You sit down either by yourself or with your loved one, and you go through your goals about where you are, and that's about the first time you need to really start looking at retirement math of, okay, if I step away from the workforce, can I, and when, and what does our cash flow look like in retirement? And last one for our 5-step process of staying on time on target is, as circumstances change your plan. So there's your biggest threat once you get 45 and over is a health issue that happens to either you or one of your loved ones that affects you financially. Emotionally, if it affects you, it can also parlay into your ability to work, those sorts of things. So just because you're on target today doesn't mean that you're going to be on target tomorrow. So you really have to stay on top of it. We talked a little bit earlier about, charting out what life is going to look like in retirement. At 45, it's a good time, and you can get online and do this with all the tools online, or you can use a professional. That is totally up to you. It's not higher level math. It's literally 8th grade math, but you kind of have to know how to apply it to make sure that you do your calculations correct. And again, it shouldn't be a hard calculation. It should be a range of calculations. There are lots of financial tools out there that can help you. But that's the first time when you really need to look, okay, I'm here now. what is life going to look at 55, 65, and above that for the rest of my life? Because you're getting to that point where you can't really make, it's kind of the last time I would say at 45 to make huge adjustments of saving huge portions of your salary to make a big difference in the outer years. So that's what I've got for you today. Thank you so much for listening in. Reach out to OTOT now with any questions or comments. Would love to hear from you and love to hear about ideas. If you have, I have each episode listed as a question. So if you have a question and you send it in to me, and then make a podcast with it, I will certainly give you credit on air. But thanks again for listening in. And here's to fighting the good fight every day to make sure that you are on time, on target with your financial goals.